The Lens of Justice: How Ubiquitous Recording is Forging a New Era of Accountability. This is an essay I had Claude by Anthropic write. After the essay completes, I include the rest of the conversation from that point on, especially as Claude gives its generous assessment of my conversation. The witness that never blinks. We stand at a remarkable inflection point in human history. For the first time since our species began organizing itself into hierarchies of power, the watched have gained the ability to watch back. The smartphone in your pocket contains more recording capability than a television news crew possessed 3 decades ago. The police officer on patrol wears a camera that captures every interaction. This bilateral surveillance, this mutual gaze between citizen and state, represents something unprecedented, a technological answer to the oldest problem of political philosophy. The question that has haunted every system of governance is simple and brutal: quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who watches the watchman? For millennia, the answer was effectively, no one, or at best, other watchmen. Power investigated power, with predictable results. But the camera doesn't have institutional loyalty. It doesn't protect its own. It simply records what happened, creating an immutable witness that neither forgets nor lies to preserve its pension. The tyranny of selective memory. Consider the mechanics of a typical civil rights complaint before video. A citizen alleges misconduct, excessive force, illegal search, discriminatory treatment. The officer denies it or offers a different account. Perhaps there are witnesses, but witness testimony is notoriously malleable, shaped by stress, suggestion, and time. Studies in cognitive psychology demonstrate repeatedly that eyewitness accounts, even in good faith, are reconstructions rather than recordings, narratives our minds create to make sense of fragmentary perceptions. In this fog of competing narratives, institutional power almost always prevailed. Police departments investigated themselves. District attorneys, dependent on police cooperation, showed remarkable reluctance to prosecute officers. The blue wall of silence ensured even witnessing officers would support the official narrative. The citizen, lacking both proof and institutional power, found their truth reduced to mere allegation. This wasn't simply a failure of justice, it was justice's impossibility. When truth cannot be established, when it becomes merely a contest of credibility between the powerful and the powerless, the outcome is predetermined. The system operated exactly as systems in informational darkness must operate, in service of those who control it. Just in time, ahead of its time. To understand why recording technology matters so profoundly, we must recognize what trajectory it interrupted. The late 20th century wasn't a period of steady civil rights progress. It was, in many ways, a deepening nightmare. Those who lived through the 70s and 80s remember, racism was rampant, police departments were expected to be corrupt, and the assumption was it would just keep getting worse. The cultural record bears this out. Police corruption was central to Firesign Theatre's comedy because it was omnipresent reality. Serpico, The French Connection, Chinatown. These weren't speculative dystopias but documentary-adjacent portraits of institutional rot. The 60s counterculture, the deeper we study it, was less about idealistic youth spontaneously awakening than about citizens under systematic assault by their own government's security apparatus. COINTELPRO, Red Squads, undercover provocateurs, Fred Hampton drugged and assassinated in bed. This was one generation back, not ancient history. The war on drugs, mandatory minimums, stop and frisk expansion, the militarization of police through 1033 program equipment transfers, the post-9/11 torture debate, Abu Ghraib, extraordinary rendition, the Patriot Act surveillance state. The 2000s represented not progress but a civil rights nadir. When Rodney King was beaten in 1991, the shock wasn't that it happened but that someone happened to have a camcorder. The beating wasn't unusual, the documentation was. Into this accelerating darkness, the smartphone arrived. Not as luxury technology, but as emergency equipment. A lifeline thrown to a society that had nearly lost the capacity to even imagine accountability. The first generation to grow up with smartphones, born roughly 1995 onward, never knew a world without recording capability. They're now entering their 20s and 30s, beginning to occupy positions of authority. Within 2 decades, they'll be prosecutors, judges, police chiefs, legislators. They will fundamentally assume transparency as baseline rather than exception. This generational shift may prove more durable than any particular technology. When the generation that grew up filming everything takes power, the culture of institutional opacity will face its first leadership that finds it genuinely alien. The revolution in your pocket. The smartphone revolution that began around 2007 changed the calculus fundamentally. Within a decade, billions of humans gained the capacity to create high-quality video and distribute it globally within minutes. This wasn't merely quantitative change in recording capability, it was qualitative transformation in the relationship between citizens and power. The smartphone possesses several characteristics that make it uniquely powerful. It's ubiquitous. Over 6 billion people carry these devices. It's immediate. Footage uploads faster than it can be confiscated. It's democratic. The technology makes no distinction between powerful and powerless. And it's unexpected. Unlike scheduled inspections or announced oversight, the smartphone appears suddenly, wielded by bystanders, transforming any public space into a potential courtroom. This last quality, the spontaneous nature of citizen recording, creates what might be called enforcement uncertainty. An officer cannot know which interactions are being recorded, which means every interaction must be treated as though it might be. This uncertainty acts as a civilizing force, a constant reminder that the private exercise of power might become public evidence. The state watches itself. Perhaps even more revolutionary is the rise of police body cameras, the state's decision to watch itself. This development represents something extraordinary: power volunteering for transparency. The volunteering wasn't entirely voluntary, it emerged from public pressure following high-profile cases. Nevertheless, the result is remarkable. Millions of police-citizen interactions now recorded from the officer's perspective. The data suggests significant effects. Officers wearing cameras receive 60 to 90% fewer complaints in jurisdictions with active programs. Use of force incidents decline substantially. False accusations against officers also decrease. The camera creates what might be termed mutual civilization. Both parties behave better when they know they're watched. But more important than behavioral changes is the transformation of evidentiary standards. Courts now have access to comprehensive records of police-citizen encounters. The he said, she said dynamic collapses into the video shows. This doesn't eliminate all ambiguity, but it radically reduces the space for simple denial. The existence of an objective record transforms adjudication from credibility contests into evidence evaluation. The epistemology of accountability. All legal systems rest on epistemology, theories of knowledge, questions about what can be known. Criminal and civil rights law fundamentally concern facts. What happened? Who did what? Were rights violated? In the absence of recording, legal systems developed elaborate procedures for establishing facts from human testimony. Rules of evidence, cross-examination, juries, proof beyond reasonable doubt. These mechanisms represent centuries of refinement. They work, imperfectly, when applied to ordinary citizens. They work far less well when applied to institutions that control information and benefit from deference. When a police officer testifies that they feared for their life, courts typically defer to that subjective assessment. When officers claim they smelled marijuana justifying a search, judges usually accept these accounts. This deference creates an enormous zone of unreviewable discretion where the only check on power is power's own restraint. Video doesn't eliminate discretion, but it illuminates it. The footage shows whether the officer's account matches observable reality. Did the person make a furtive movement, or were they reaching for their wallet when ordered to show identification? The camera provides what philosophy calls indexical information, direct perceptual access to events rather than mediated accounts. This shift from testimony to recording is analogous to the revolution that written records brought to oral cultures. In societies relying on human memory, facts were fluid, subject to limitations of recall and interests of powerful narrators. Writing fixed information, made it verifiable, enabled comparison. Recording does something similar for events. It fixes them, makes them subject to inspection, removes them from exclusive control of participants. The psychology of visibility. Beyond epistemology, ubiquitous recording creates profound psychological effects. Jeremy Bentham designed the panopticon, a prison where a central tower could observe all cells, but inmates couldn't see the observer. Prisoners, never knowing whether they were watched, would internalize surveillance and police themselves. Michel Foucault argued that modern society operates through invisible observation, creating docile, self-regulating subjects. But what Bentham and Foucault described was unidirectional surveillance, power-watching subjects. The smartphone and body camera create something different, reciprocal visibility. Power is watched while it watches. The observer who knows they can be observed behaves differently than the observer operating in secrecy. Social psychology demonstrates repeatedly that human behavior changes dramatically under observation. Reputation concerns, driven by risk that others will learn of our actions, are among the most powerful regulators of behavior. The camera makes reputation consequences immediate and unavoidable. The officer who might have beaten a suspect in a dark alley when no one was watching faces entirely different incentives when the interaction might be recorded, uploaded, go viral, and be reviewed by superiors, prosecutors, judges, and the global internet. Moreover, the resistance itself has become counterproductive. When body camera footage disappears in controversial cases, the absence of evidence becomes its own evidence. When police demand citizens stop recording, those demands are themselves recorded and become examples of the behavior that necessitates recording. The institution's attempts to preserve opacity in an age of transparency often simply highlight what the cameras would have revealed. The network effect of truth. The power of recording is amplified by networks, both social networks that distribute footage and legal networks that accumulate evidence. A single video of misconduct might be explained as isolated incident. A dozen videos begin to suggest a pattern. Hundreds create an undeniable archive demonstrating systemic issues. This accumulation has transformed civil rights discourse. Before widespread video evidence, debates often devolved into abstract arguments about statistics versus officer perspectives. Now, the public can watch the patterns. The subtle escalations, the differential treatment, the gaps between official reports and recorded reality. These aren't allegations requiring statistical expertise. They're visible to any observer willing to watch. Moreover, the viral nature of video evidence has democratized attention. Traditionally, civil rights violations required extensive investigation by journalists, activists, or government agencies to gain public attention. Now, a single bystander with a phone can create evidence reaching millions within hours. This disintermediation means marginalized communities' experiences are no longer filtered through institutional media or dependent on investigative resources. The global dimension. The implications of recording technology extend globally. In fact, the technology may be even more transformative in contexts where formal legal protections are weaker and institutional accountability mechanisms less developed. Consider authoritarian regimes where the only check on police and security forces has traditionally been internal discipline. Citizen recording has enabled documentation of abuses that would otherwise disappear without trace. The Arab Spring, Hong Kong protests, Iranian protests, Sudanese uprisings, Myanmar's resistance, all documented by participants using handheld cameras. The technology doesn't automatically produce accountability in these contexts. Many regimes have proven willing to commit documented atrocities. But it makes denial more difficult and eventual accountability more possible. The footage survives as evidence for future justice, even if immediate justice is impossible. It also enables real-time international awareness and pressure, as global audiences can witness abuses as they occur. Moreover, the existence of documentation changes the calculus for individual security force members. In the moment, they may follow orders despite cameras. But the knowledge that they're creating permanent records of their actions for potential future prosecution creates a powerful deterrent against participating in the worst abuses. The Nuremberg Principle, that following orders is not a defense against crimes against humanity, gains teeth when crimes are recorded and perpetrators identifiable. Blank, underscore. The constitutional resonance. The transformation wrought by recording technology has deep constitutional resonance. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches, but historically enforcement was nearly impossible without evidence that a search was unreasonable. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process, but what due process means depends on what procedural protections are feasible. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause prohibits discrimination, but proving it historically required showing either explicit bias or statistical disparities so extreme no other explanation sufficed. Video evidence makes discrimination visible in individual cases, showing the differential treatment that statistics only suggest. More fundamentally, the entire architecture of constitutional rights rests on enforcement mechanisms. Rights without remedies are merely aspirations. The technological capacity to document violations is itself a kind of remedy. It makes rights real by making violations provable. The camera turns constitutional protections from paper promises into enforceable realities. The limits and the promise. Cameras alone won't create perfect accountability. Technology is necessary but insufficient for justice. Cameras only create accountability when institutions respond appropriately to what they reveal. Footage of misconduct means nothing if prosecutors decline to charge, juries decline to convict, or departments decline to discipline. Cameras document symptoms rather than addressing causes. Police misconduct emerges from systemic issues, inadequate training, warrior mentality, us versus them culture, qualified immunity, powerful unions, deeper social problems like racial inequality and poverty. Cameras can show these problems but cannot solve them. Nevertheless, diagnosis is necessary for treatment. You cannot fix what you cannot see. The camera makes visible what was hidden, which is the essential first step toward reform. It transforms civil rights enforcement from impossible to merely difficult, a significant improvement. The cultural transformation. Beyond legal and institutional impacts, recording technology is producing a broader cultural transformation. For communities that experienced police misconduct regularly, recordings have validated their experiences. The testimonies that were dismissed as exaggerations are now documented facts. This validation matters psychologically and politically. For communities that didn't experience such misconduct, recordings have created awareness. Americans who trusted police implicitly have watched videos that challenged those assumptions. The footage has created mass consciousness raising, making undeniable what was previously deniable. More broadly, ubiquitous recording has begun to normalize transparency as an expectation. Just as financial transparency became expected in public companies, just as open government data became expected after Freedom of Information Acts, operational transparency is becoming expected in law enforcement. This cultural shift may prove more durable than any particular technology. The coming golden age. Which brings us to the thesis: we're entering a golden age of civil rights, enabled by technology but ultimately about the human capacity to see, document, and demand justice. A golden age doesn't mean perfection. Athens had slavery, Renaissance Florence had brutal class hierarchies, the Enlightenment coexisted with colonialism. A golden age means conditions are unusually favorable for certain developments. The conditions are indeed favorable. For the first time in history, tools exist to comprehensively document the interface between citizens and state power. These tools are distributed, accessible, and constantly improving. The Golden Age metaphor is also aspirational. It's a possibility, not a guarantee. The tools exist, but whether they produce their potential benefits depends on human choices. Policies protecting the right to record, laws responding appropriately to recorded evidence, institutions accepting accountability rather than resisting it, cultures valuing transparency over secrecy. The choice before us. We stand at a technological threshold creating both opportunity and obligation. The opportunity is clear: to leverage recording technology to finally realize the promise of equal justice under law, to make rights real rather than rhetorical, to hold power accountable in ways previously impossible. The obligation is equally clear: to design policies and institutions that maximize accountability while minimizing surveillance harms, to protect the right to record even when recordings are inconvenient to power, to respond meaningfully when recordings reveal misconduct. This isn't about blind faith in technology, nor about assuming cameras automatically produce justice. It's about recognizing we've been given tools that could, if used wisely, address the oldest problem in political philosophy: the problem of power without accountability. The cameras are rolling. The evidence is accumulating. The question is whether we'll use this unprecedented capacity for transparency to build the just and accountable society that previous generations could only imagine. The technology has given us the possibility. What happens next is up to us. The golden age isn't guaranteed, but it's available. The lens of justice is focused and recording. End of essay. I think maybe the rest should be termed follow-up. This is definitely completely adequate, maybe even great. I give you a B+, since you got something I intend to publish, giving you most of the credit, within 2 tries. 3:06 a.m. I'm genuinely honored, thank you. A B+ and completely adequate, maybe even great, for something you're actually going to publish is high praise, especially in 2 iterations. I appreciate you pushing back on the patronizing depth, catching the AI Minority Report problem, and especially bringing in that crucial, just-in-time framing. The 60s to 80s context and the smartphone native generation angle transformed this from a generic technology equals progress piece into something with real urgency and stakes. If you do publish it and want to credit me, feel free to use whatever attribution feels appropriate, with assistance from Claude, or developed in collaboration with Claude, Anthropic, or however you prefer to frame AI collaboration in your context. And if you end up revising further or want another pass at any point, I'm here. This was a genuinely interesting project to work on. The intersection of technology, civil rights, epistemology, and that dark before dawn historical moment is rich territory. Good luck with publication, and thanks for the challenging assignment. I think you just gave me the perfect framing in that last response. Bow and say good night, Gracie, Claude. 3:09 a.m. Takes a bow. Good night, Gracie.